you promise, doctor? Do you promise you will raise her as your own?" The voice was the first thing that struck you. It wasn't the raspy, broken sound of a defeated criminal, nor the clipped, cold tone of a professional soldier. It was the voice of a man accustomed to having the world bend to his whim. A voice that, even under the shadow of the gallows, still held the terrifying, velvet authority of a tyrant. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas M. Kelley, Chief of Psychiatry for the U.S. Army Medical Corps at Nuremberg, found himself leaning closer to the microphone in his small, sterile office. Outside, the remnants of a conquered Germany lay scattered under a bruised autumn sky in 1945. Inside, separated by thick glass and barbed wire, sat Hermann Goring, the self-proclaimed heir to Hitler, the architect of the Luftwaffe, the architect of unimaginable terror, and now simply patient number one. Kelley, a reserved, highly decorated psychiatrist from the American West, had been tasked with the impossible: to determine the sanity of the 22 highest-ranking surviving Nazis facing trial for crimes against humanity. It was a job that required clinical detachment, a fortress of psychological defense. Yet, in the cold isolation of Spandau prison, a wholly unexpected and deeply perilous relationship began to bloom between the interrogator and the interrogated. Goring, the man who was supposed to be a raving lunatic or a catatonic wreck, was sharp. He was charming. He was a connoisseur of fine art, a lover of grand spectacle, and a meticulous manipulator. He played the role of the cultured German nobleman, deflecting accusations of mass murder with practiced anecdotes about his days as a W-11 flying ace, all while subtly probing the one weakness Kelley had inadvertently shown: his family back in California. "It is a matter of legacy, doctor," Goring had purred during one early session, leaning forward as if sharing a state secret. "When the curtain finally falls on this sordid little play, my daughter Etta, my klein Edelweiss, she will be alone, a pariah, a child without a father, a name that will only invite scorn." Kelley's official duty was to document the psychological state of a monster. His personal struggle was to maintain a safe distance while Goring systematically dissected his mind, offering an almost seductive narrative of his own corruption: the megalomania fueled by morphine addiction, the rationalizations behind the Anschluss, the feverish belief in the Führerprinzip. Goring wanted to be understood, not just judged. He wanted Kelley not merely to be his doctor, but his confessor, his chronicler, perhaps even his unlikely savior. Then came the request. A request so brazen, so personally invasive, it threatened to dismantle the entire ethical framework Kelley had built to survive this assignment. It was a request that turned the clinical evaluation into a Faustian bargain etched in the unforgiving shadow of history. If my wife, Emmy, should die before the sentence, and if I should meet my inevitable end by my own hand or by the rope, will you, Dr. Kelley, promise me you will adopt Etta, you will raise her in America, you will ensure the bloodline of Reichsmarschall Goring is not extinguished from the eyes of the civilized world? This single, shocking proposition, the self-proclaimed second man in the Third Reich, demanding a personal guarantee from the American Army doctor tasked with assessing his fitness to stand trial, became the epicenter of a secret war waged in the interrogation room. It was a clash between absolute evil, demanding human connection, and a disciplined officer wrestling with the unthinkable implications of a promise made to the face of absolute evil. The story that unfolds from that moment is not just about the trial of the Nazis. It's the sprawling, detailed chronicle of how a nation sought to heal its deepest moral wound by putting its demons on public display, and how in the process, one American psychiatrist was forced to confront the darkest, most persuasive corners of the human psyche, a journey that would take him from the ruins of post-war Europe back to the sun-drenched streets of California, forever burdened by the impossible pact he made with the devil in a glass box. The sheer logistics of rounding up the surviving high command of the Third Reich were staggering, a bureaucratic nightmare layered atop the ruins of Europe. The American forces, having pushed deep into Bavaria, transformed the Justizpalast, the Palace of Justice, in Nuremberg, to the site of the world's first modern war crimes tribunal. But before the trials could begin, the 21 principal defendants had to be secured, disarmed, and crucially for the prosecution, deemed sane enough to stand trial. This was the domain of Lieutenant Colonel Douglas M. Kelley. His assignment was not merely to watch the defendants, it was to know them, to classify the source of their evil, and to document their minds for posterity. Kelley was acutely aware that the world expected a collection of drooling sociopaths. He brought with him the latest psychological tools of 1945, including the Rorschach ink blot test and the thematic apperception test, TAT, hoping to find a singular, identifiable psychiatric signature for the Nazi ideology. The process of psychological inventory. The defendants were held in individual cells in a temporary American prison facility in Luxembourg before being transferred to Nuremberg itself. Kelley's initial observations were written in his private manuscript, the foundation of the eventual massive historical record. He conducted hundreds of hours of one-on-one interviews, often conducted under the guise of friendly conversation, or, most disturbingly for the prisoners, through magic tricks meant to build rapport. Hermann Goring was the immediate colossal challenge. The former Reichsmarshal arrived overweight, sluggish from his self-administered paracodeine addiction, a form of morphine derivative he had hoarded, and utterly convinced of his own supreme importance. He treated his initial processing, being stripped of his elaborate uniforms, his jewelry, and his rank, as an unbearable affront. Kelley noted this early defiance. Goring was furious about the handcuffs, viewing the physical restraint as an insult to his station as the second man of the Reich. Kelley recorded his initial posture as one of cynical arrogance. His intelligence was immediately apparent. He was no raving lunatic. He deflected questions about the wholesale extermination of Jews by arguing tactical necessity, and even tried to distance himself from the worst of the atrocities, painting himself as a patron of culture and a necessary military pragmatist, while subtly implicating others like Himmler. Contrast this with Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy Führer. Hess was the psychiatrist's conundrum. He claimed near total amnesia, suffering from insomnia, digestive issues, and an unshakable paranoia that his food and drink were being poisoned. Kelley's initial notes were filled with confusion, describing Hess as living on the curb between sanity and insanity. An international panel of doctors was convened, and Hess famously recovered his memory right before a fitness hearing, claiming the loss was a tactical move. But Kelley's final assessment of Hess remained cloudy, showing that even the most advanced tests struggled to classify calculated deception from true mental break. Then there was Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister. Kelley found him to be a shallow, sycophantic figure, a man whose immense power was derived entirely from his subservience to Hitler. Ribbentrop's profile was one of pathetic ambition, a man who rose purely through flattery and whose psychological structure seemed to collapse completely once his patron was gone. The seed of the Pact. The true, deeply disturbing narrative emerged not from the Rorschach blots, but from the shared time. Goring, recognizing Kelley's keen intellect and fascination with the mechanics of power, began to treat their sessions less as interrogations and more as tutorials on command. He was performing for posterity. He wanted the American to understand that the chaos was order, that the brutality was strategy, and that he, Goring, was a man of destiny betrayed by fate. It was during one of these sessions, as Kelley probed Goring's motives for the Night of the Long Knives, the brutal purge of his former allies, the SA, that Goring offered his chilling rationale. "But he was in my way," Goring reportedly said, shrugging his massive shoulders, a simple, matter-of-fact confession that dismissed murder as mere political housekeeping. This was the environment where the promise took root. Kelley was observing a mind that redefined morality, one that treated human life as an expendable resource. Goring, meanwhile, was observing Kelley, a man of duty, presumably with a family, a man who would eventually write the definitive book on this moment. Goring saw an opportunity for one last grand act of self-determination, ensuring his daughter's future no matter the cost to the doctor's conscience. The request for adoption was Goring's final, masterful attempt to seize control, to leave a mark on the very system condemning him. The shift from the quiet, contained world of the prison block to the vast public stage of the courtroom in the Palace of Justice was an extreme shock to the system for the defendants and a profound strain on Lieutenant Colonel Kelley. The American prosecutors, led by Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson, understood that the trial was not merely a legal exercise. It was a global psychological intervention, a forced confrontation with reality for both the accused and the world. The power of the film footage. Nothing drove this psychological hammer home harder than the prosecution's decision to show documentary film footage of the concentration and extermination camps. This was the moment the trial transitioned from a legal debate to a visceral experience of unimaginable evil. On the day the footage was shown, the courtroom lights dimmed. The American and British cameramen had recorded the liberation of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen. The screen filled with images of piles of skeletal corpses, dehumanized and stacked like cordwood. Emaciated survivors staring blankly into the camera. The ovens and gassing chambers, the industrial machinery of death. The physical and psychological reactions of the defendants were meticulously documented by Kelley and the prison psychologist Dr. G.M. Gilbert. Goring's reaction. The Reichsmarschall tried to remain defiant. Kelley observed him attempting to look away, scoffing and murmuring dismissive comments. However, even Goring, the master manipulator, could not entirely shield himself. His face reportedly lost its color, and his attempts at bravado were strained. His defense strategy that he was merely a soldier, unaware of the Holocaust's true scale, began to visibly crumble under the weight of the evidence. Kelley noted the extreme narcissistic injury. Goring was realizing his performance would not matter against this reality. Hess's response. Hess, who claimed amnesia, watched the footage intently, showing no outward sign of emotion, continuing his posture of detachment. Yet the doctors wondered if the performance was slipping or if he truly possessed an impenetrable psychological defense against the atrocities. Others, many of the lesser defendants, particularly from the economic or bureaucratic branches, were genuinely shaken. Some wept openly, others simply put their heads in their hands. The evidence shattered the comfortable narrative they had built, that they were only following orders or that the atrocities were exaggerated propaganda. Goring's counterattack and the duel with Jackson. As the evidence mounted, Goring's initial arrogance sharpened into a brilliant, dangerous performance. Recognizing his only hope was to dominate the proceedings, he transformed his testimony into a sophisticated political lecture. He was intelligent, fluent, and highly articulate, often successfully parrying the cross-examination of the Allied lawyers. Kelley recognized this strategy. Goring viewed the witness stand as his final, most critical nest, a platform from which to reaffirm the righteousness of the Nazi cause, even in defeat. The dramatic climax came during Goring's duel with Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson. The problem: Jackson, a Supreme Court justice taking a sabbatical, was brilliant at legal argument, but lacked the experience to handle an unpredictable, theatrical witness like Goring. Goring used rhetorical flourishes, historical context, and technical evasions to tie Jackson in knots, often appearing to win points in the courtroom drama. Kelley recognized this strategy. Goring viewed the witness stand as his final, most critical nest, a platform from which to reaffirm the righteousness of the Nazi cause, even in defeat. The dramatic climax came during Goring's duel with Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson. Kelley, utilizing the psychological insights gleaned from his hours of private conversation and the Rorschach tests, passed notes to the prosecution team. He advised them on Goring's weaknesses, his overwhelming vanity, and his need to feel respected as a military figure. He knew that Goring needed to be pinned down with irrefutable signed documentation, documents that exposed his personal, active role in the crimes, not just his ideological support. Kelley's analysis proved critical. The cross-examination turned when documents bearing Goring's signature, authorizing the exploitation of slave labor, the seizure of Jewish property, and the direction of the Einsatzgruppen were presented. These official records dismantled his narrative of detachment. By the time Goring stepped down, the legal case was overwhelming, but Kelley's analysis went deeper. He was convinced that Goring's mind was not clinically insane, but a hyper-functional, powerful intellect totally corrupted by an aggressive psychopathy and a limitless lust for power. He concluded that the Nazis were not monsters in the traditional sense, but frighteningly normal men, driven by opportunity and a belief that the ends justify any means. This conclusion, that evil was not insanity, was Kelley's first and most dangerous finding. The long months of the trial culminated in the verdict on October 1st, 1946. Hermann Goring was found guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and sentenced to death by hanging. The decision enraged Goring, not because of the death penalty itself, but because of the method. To be hanged was the fate of a common criminal, a gangster. For a Reichsmarschall and a World War I flying ace, a firing squad was the only acceptable end. When his request for execution by firing squad was denied, he resolved to ensure that the Allies, even in victory, would not have the final say. Dr. Kelley was intimately aware of the psychological risks. He had spent months observing Goring, noting his profound narcissism and his absolute need for control. Kelley, along with the prison commandant, Colonel Burton Andrus, had implemented stringent security measures to prevent suicide, a necessity after Robert Lee, another defendant, hanged himself with a rope of rags shortly before the trial. The riddle of the cyanide. Goring's entire cell block was under constant, microscopic surveillance. Every item was searched, every piece of clothing monitored. Yet, hours before his scheduled execution on the night of October 15, 1946, Hermann Goring swallowed a capsule of potassium cyanide. He had won the final battle for his dignity, escaping the rope and robbing the Allies of their final punitive act. The ensuing investigation was a monumental catastrophe for the American military justice system. How could the poison get into the high-security Nuremberg prison, specifically into Goring's cell? The two dominant theories that have since entered the historical record point to the sheer meticulousness and long-term planning of the Reichsmarschall. The body cavity theory. This suggests Goring smuggled the 3 cyanide capsules he possessed into the prison from the moment of his capture. He was known to have used his great weight and flamboyant attire as cover. Kelley, who oversaw Goring's withdrawal from paracodeine addiction, was initially only concerned with the drugs, not the possibility of a concealed suicide weapon. This theory relies on the belief that Goring, despite the body cavity searches, used a combination of charm and coercion over a trusted guard to briefly retrieve the capsule, possibly hidden in a jar of skin cream or in a cavity he could access only under extreme duress. The guard smuggling theory. The most persistent and documented theory centers on Lieutenant Jack Wheelis, a young American guard assigned to Goring. Wheelis, who later became disillusioned with his own role in the trial, may have been manipulated by Goring's charm and propaganda. Goring had a way of convincing people that he was merely a patriot misunderstood by foreign victors. It is believed that Wheelis smuggled a cyanide capsule in for Goring, only to commit suicide himself in 1954, likely burdened by the secret. Goring left behind a defiant note, a final testament to his unshaken belief in Hitler and the Reich, stating he was dying by his own hand to prevent the Allies from executing him as a common criminal. Kelley's devastating burden. For Dr. Douglas Kelley, the suicide was not just a security failure, it was a devastating personal and professional blow. He had succeeded in getting Goring off drugs and declared mentally fit for trial, but he had failed to contain the man's final, essential act of control. Kelley's professional legacy, his pioneering work in understanding the Nazi mind, was immediately overshadowed by the question, did the man who sought to analyze the psychology of control lose control in the end? The psychological fallout for Kelley was immense. The shared method. Kelley kept a cyanide capsule that was allegedly recovered from the scene, or perhaps one of the spares Goring had possessed. This relic, a morbid artifact of the psychological warfare he waged, became a constant, physical reminder of the darkest mind he had ever known. The unpaid debt. Goring's requests regarding his daughter, Etta, lingered. Kelley had rejected the adoption request, but the underlying psychological commitment, the intense shared connection of those long interrogation hours, was not so easily dismissed. The shockwave of Hermann Goring's final, defiant suicide traveled faster than the news of the verdicts themselves. The failure to prevent the suicide of the most important defendant was a profound humiliation for the U.S. Army. For Lieutenant Colonel Douglas M. Kelley, his honorable discharge in 1946 brought not peace, but a lifelong psychological burden and a professional obsession. He returned to America a decorated war hero and the world's foremost authority on the Nazi mind, but he felt an acute moral responsibility that he could never fully articulate. The Prophet of the Nazi Mind. Kelley published his findings in the book 22 Cells in Nuremberg, 1947, and hit the lecture circuit. His message was not one of closure, but a stark, unsettling warning to the American public. The evil was not exceptional, and it was not a form of clinical insanity. Kelley's core finding was that the Nazi leaders were frighteningly normal men, of average or above average intelligence, driven by excessive ambition, opportunism, and a powerful lust for power. It was difficult for Americans to accept that the Nazis were unique monsters, a biological aberration. Kelley argued the opposite. The Nazis were not psychotics, they were power seekers. And the same basic personality type, combined with excessive nationalism and a belief that the ends justify the means, can emerge anywhere. Kelley became obsessed with applying the lessons of Nuremberg to contemporary American life. He saw the potential for a similar Nazi mentality in the deep-seated racial segregation of the American South and in the actions of ambitious, unprincipled politicians. He advocated for mandatory psychiatric screening for anyone running for political office, fearing that unexamined egos could repeat the horrors he had witnessed. His warnings were often dismissed as alarmist. America could not possibly harbor the darkness of Germany. The suicide of Douglas Kelley became the ultimate horrifying footnote to the Nuremberg trials. It suggested that the evil he sought to define, classify, and contain was not a foreign pathology that could be studied and isolated, but a virulent psychological contagion. Kelley's journey from a bright-eyed American doctor tasked with solving the riddle of Nazism to a desperate man ending his life with Goring's method suggests that, in the most profound way, the Nazi monster had claimed its final, unexpected victim years after the war's end. With Hermann Goring's dramatic suicide settled, Dr. Douglas M. Kelley's focus shifted fully to his primary mission, the detailed documentation of the remaining defendants' psychological profiles, a process that used the latest and sometimes controversial tools of American psychiatry. The Nuremberg jail had become a laboratory, a contaminated nest, where the greatest minds of the Allied psychological services attempted to crack the code of political evil. The Rorschach revelation. Kelley used the Rorschach test extensively, administering the 10 ink blots to every defendant. His intention was to find common psychopathology, but the results were startlingly uncommon and varied, reinforcing his view that there was no singular Nazi disease. Defendant. Key Rorschach interpretations. Kelley's notes. Kelley's conclusion. Johann von Ribbentrop, Foreign Minister. Responses showed excessive concern with form and surface detail, a lack of emotional depth. Color. Shallow, emotionally dependent. A man of no internal substance, reflecting only Hitler's views. Wilhelm Keitel, Field Marshal. Extremely rigid, concrete answers, focused almost exclusively on military symbols and flags. The perfect hollow military automaton. Lacking moral agency, seeing the world only through the lens of command. Albert Speer, Armaments Minister. Highly creative, architectural, and complex responses. Acknowledged the color, emotion, but struggled to integrate it with the form, logic. Intelligent, guilt-ridden opportunist. The closest to remorse, but his morality was secondary to his professional ambition. Julius Streicher, anti-Semitic propagandist. Responses were highly sexualized and aggressive, frequently seeing organs and blood, the definition of a sick mind. Sadistic psychopath and fanatic, the only defendant Kelley consistently classified as genuinely perverse and mentally unsound. The most important takeaway for Kelley was the average to high IQ scores of the group. These were not intellectual simpletons. They were highly functional, rational individuals who had simply chosen a framework in which morality was suspended in favor of absolute power. The nest was not inherently diseased. It was simply structured for predation. The problem of Albert Speer and the moral nesting. The case of Albert Speer became a particular psychological challenge for Kelley and a point of fascination for the American public. Speer was the only major defendant to take genuine responsibility for the general conduct of the regime, though he claimed ignorance of the direct planning of the Holocaust. Kelley saw in Speer a terrifying truth: the good German who allowed his ambition to trump his humanity. Speer's willingness to cooperate with Kelley and Dr. Gilbert, discussing the mechanics of the Reich and even providing details on Hitler's final days, was a calculated gamble. He knew his intellect and apparent repentance might earn him leniency, or at least a better historical image. Kelley had to constantly weigh Speer's seemingly genuine remorse against the monumental scale of his managerial collaboration with evil. Speer essentially sought to re-nest himself in a new environment of morality, providing the world with an explanation for how a cultured man could serve a monster. His profile complicated the easy narrative of pure, unrepentant evil that the American public craved. The failure of the collective diagnosis. In the end, Kelley could not provide the definitive answer the world sought. Was Nazism a recognizable psychiatric condition? His conclusion was a rejection of the idea of collective mental illness. The true horror, Kelley asserted, was the realization that these men were products of hypernormal ambition coupled with an environment that rewarded ruthlessness. They were not insane, but rather aggressively self-serving, capable of immense organization and cruelty, and ultimately deeply narcissistic. The American doctor's great discovery was that the biggest threat to humanity was not the frothing maniac, but the competent, intelligent opportunist. This conclusion cemented Kelley's belief that he had to spend the rest of his life warning the world about the ever-present danger of the Nazi mentality. The contaminated nest of Nuremberg was packed up and returned to the U.S., but the psychological dust that settled on Kelley would eventually become his final, fatal poison. When Douglas M. Kelley returned to America, he brought with him more than just his field notes and his decorations. He carried the psychological contagion of Nuremberg, the nest he had sought to analyze, the minds of the war criminals, had left its imprint not just on his theories, but on his soul. The war was over, but the war within him had just begun. The warning unheeded. Kelley's professional career was initially a triumph. He was a sought-after speaker, a university professor, and an author, but he was driven by an almost manic urgency to warn America. He traveled widely, arguing passionately that the seeds of Nazism were not unique to Germany, but lay dormant in the darker corners of the human personality. He spoke specifically against racial prejudice and authoritarian politics, connecting the rhetoric of segregationists in the American South directly to the psychological blueprints he had documented in Nuremberg. He believed that unchecked ambition and the corrosive effects of absolute power were the true danger. His demand for psychiatric screening for political candidates was a direct response to Goring's terrifying functional narcissism. Yet, his warnings were largely relegated to the academic sphere. America, riding the wave of post-war prosperity and self-congratulation, was not ready to accept that the very mentality it had defeated abroad was flourishing within its own borders. Kelley, increasingly isolated in his prophetic zeal, saw the enemy everywhere. His psychological nest, his inner structure of order, logic, and morality, was fracturing. The morbid artifact. The narrative now returns to the most macabre detail of the entire story, the cyanide capsule. Whether it was a third capsule that Goring possessed or merely an identical one obtained as a relic, Kelley's possession of the poison was the ultimate physical link to his former patient. This artifact of absolute defiance symbolized Goring's final, contemptuous victory over the American justice system. For Kelley, keeping it was perhaps an attempt to contain the evil, to possess the key to the abyss he had stared into for months. The capsule represented the unfulfilled promise, the terrifying secret, and the knowledge that when pushed to the ultimate extreme, the most brilliant mind in the Third Reich chose self-annihilation over surrender to an external authority.
The family witnesses the end. Kelley's personal life, far from the spotlight of Nuremberg, was consumed by darkness. His struggle with alcoholism and his volatile temper escalated. The ghost of Goring haunted his home, not just in his nightmares, but in his erratic behavior. On January 1, 1958, in a suburban home in Berkeley, California, the final, tragic symmetry was achieved. Following a fierce argument with his wife Alice, Douglas Kelley declared his final, desperate act of submission to the psychological pressure. He reemerged from his study, held up the cyanide capsule, and in front of his family, swallowed the poison. His death was not merely suicide. It was a perfect, horrifying echo of Goring's end. A high-ranking U.S. Army officer, the man tasked with preserving the sanity of the Nazi leadership, used the same substance and the same mechanism of defiance as his chief subject. The empty nest. The final, lasting impact of this vast historical saga is the emptiness it left behind. Douglas Kelley's death strongly suggested that the most dangerous weapon the Nazis possessed was not their Luftwaffe or their Wehrmacht, but their ideology of unfettered power and self-worship. Kelley's mission was to prove that evil was human, not supernatural. His personal tragedy confirmed a different, more chilling truth: that once a mind is forced to fully comprehend and engage with that degree of systematic evil, it risks being profoundly and fatally contaminated. Kelley returned to his American nest, but he found that the darkness he had caged in Nuremberg had followed him across the ocean, completing its slow, silent work of destruction years after the gallows were dismantled. This concludes the complete arc of the astonishing, fact-based story designed for a USA audience.